I'm sure each and every one of our viewers is familiar with those taking part in the console wars of today: Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft. And while PlayStation has been bathing in players' love for years, with the Big N being one of the industry's trailblazers, the first Xbox saw light of day much later. But that didn't prevent Microsoft from becoming a formidable competitor on the console market. And today, I'm going to tell you when this long path to success began. Please leave a like, subscribe, and make yourself comfortable as we are about to begin. Xbox owes its birth to Sony's loud statement made at the PS2 announcement. The Japanese lads not only told about their new console, but also positioned it as a direct competitor to personal computers. Microsoft couldn't have ignored such a provocation, as the only thing that is more famous than their console is their Windows operating system. Besides, the rivalry for the title of the main home entertainment device had been brewing for quite some time. As a result, the green light was given to a whole of two versions of the console. The first one had a platform of its own with its own architecture. This variant was promptly scrapped, making way to the second one, a specialized gaming computer based on Windows. Since the project was handled by DirectX development team, the prototype of their console was often called DirectX Box. As you have probably guessed, the name Xbox came from this very title. The development itself was quite tough. The team had to abandon the idea of computer running on Windows and return to the option of a standalone console, as computer components would have significantly increased the production cost. This decision led to countless scandals, because asking Bill Gates to choose something beside Windows is like making Henry Ford drive a Toyota. The project only stayed afloat because Sony still had to be fought, which meant that suspending the development wasn't an option. Another problem arrived in the form of the game that was positioned as the main exclusive of the future Xbox: Halo Combat Evolved. Microsoft had certain troubles negotiating with the studios. The Micros were trying to buy out studios to ensure exclusivity for their games. Thus, they came across Bungie, a company that was on the verge of bankruptcy at the time. Microsoft were openly mocked, as console first-person shooters were perceived as a dead genre. On top of that, Halo looked poor on trade show demonstrations and lagged a lot. But not long before the release date, it unleashed its potential, and the audience's anger promptly switched not just to mercy, but to adoration. So, what was special about this best console shooter since GoldenEye? To begin with, the sheer scale of the events. The game's story was about a war between humanity and an alliance of alien races. Humans were barely holding on under the enemy's onslaught, and the last hope was put in the modified super soldiers called the Spartans. The aliens destroyed the planet where the soldiers were created, and only one spaceship successfully made its escape. We had to take the role of the last remaining Spartan named John 117, defend the ship, and lead the fight for humanity. Besides an epic story, Halo's gameplay was also pleasantly surprising. It was here that popular features of modern shooters first appeared, such as fighting both on foot and in vehicles, or the ability to carry only two weapons. The AI also added certain surprises, like believable firefights with the use of cover. On top of that, Halo took full advantage of Xbox hardware. The game stood out for both excellent graphics and great dynamics that was just as great even in multiplayer. The latter, by the way, was so popular that fans often had special parties when they would connect 4 consoles and TVs to the same network, thus allowing a total of 16 people to play together. In short, the bet placed on the console's main game turned out not to be just a success, but a jackpot. Of course, such a success would hardly have been possible if Microsoft hadn't been so lucky with the specialists who worked at Bungie. The studio gathered true professionals of their fields. Just take a look at Halo's combat system. It's scary to think how much work and sweat it took back in the day to write all these mechanics, and most importantly, make them work properly in the game. But back to the difficulties with finding developers. Microsoft had a hard time not only finding studios for exclusives, but also just releasing games on Xbox. To many, The console from Microsoft seemed like a failure at first, especially since the first presentations were structured solely around the potential commercial success of Xbox. Wouldn't you agree that when even such a well-respected company comes to your door and tells you about how they're gonna capture the market with their startup, it's pretty hard to approve of their idea without at least the slightest doubt? What made a better impression were the really outstanding technical specifics. The console was at least 2 times more powerful than PlayStation 2 in literally every aspect, which allowed it to support graphics that can be called decent even by today's standards. Just look at the very same Halo. Another feature was the built-in hard drive, which replaced memory cards. As the presentation strategy changed, so did the opinion on Microsoft's console. A perfect example of initially doubtful developer was Bethesda. At first, its director Todd Howard couldn't understand who would want a PC game on a console, but the presentation of technical specifications impressed him so much that in the end, The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind was ported to Xbox. I'm pretty sure that literally everyone has heard about this legendary first-person RPG, but not to go through it would be a sin. In Morrowind, we had to create our own character who belonged to one of the 10 races and possessed a number of stats. And then we were off to explore a province of a vast fantasy world. Like in any respectful protagonist, your character had to complete a series of quests and save the world from yet another threat. This time, it was a local divinity wishing to take over Morrowind. Of course, apart from the main plot, the game had numerous smaller stories that made the in-game world much more interesting and lively. Many fans praise the third part of the Elder Scrolls series to this very day for its amazing atmosphere. The icing on the cake was the remarkable soundtrack, for which I, for example, would load one of my city saves and do nothing. Just listen to the music. All of this made Morrowind insanely popular. Of course, the game is primarily associated with PCs, but its sales on Xbox were inferior only to those of Halo. Talking about multi-platformer games, it's impossible not to mention the continuation of the Need for Speed series titled Underground. The new NFS was still the same arcade racing sim about cool cars, but it was here where the franchise's signature style took form. Night City races, crazy car tuning, and of course, the soundtrack, popular to this day. Moreover, Underground had a story that didn't try to draw attention away from the actual races and nicely complemented the game. As for the Xbox version of Need for Speed, it was executed perfectly. Of course, its graphics were a bit worse than those of the PC version, but in comparison with PS2 and GameCube ports, the Xbox port looked much prettier while maintaining a stable frame rate. The game's sequel, reasonably titled Underground 2, also took full advantage of the console power, so the graphics became even better. But of course, it weren't just the visuals that have been improved in the sequel. The car fleet became larger and more diverse, just like the tuning, while the plot turned into a full-fledged story that unfolded along with your progress. Underground 2 could even surprise you with sudden events. For example, the player's character could be invited to photo shoots for various magazines and disc covers. I mean, yeah, you could be awarded with those after a race in the previous game as well, but here it was a separate event that you even had to drive to. It's hard to describe my emotions when a real car magazine with a sample of my exquisite designer taste on the cover was added to my gallery, and all of this was accessible in 2004 on a console, almost without FPS drops or downgrades in graphical effects. In a word, fantastic. Returning to the exclusives, a few words can be said about the racing opposite of NFS, Forza Motorsport. The differences from Underground were drastic. Instead of illegal street racing, virtual racers had to study official tracks, and freakish tuning gave way to meticulous and realistic car adjustments. Damage physics were also way more realistic, so you could no longer turn by simply huddling up against the track walls. But these differences did not make Forza worse than Need for Speed. Rather, it provided a different, and most importantly, equally fun experience. One of the main features of the game was an enormous car fleet. even by today's standards, containing a total of 231 cars. And of course, it's impossible not to praise the graphics, which even now don't seem outdated. As a result, Forza was warmly welcomed by players and was able to give birth to an entire series of car simulators with new parts being released even today. While searching for developers, Microsoft was lucky to acquire another studio, Rare. Known to us for Battletoads, for example. Thanks to this, Xbox exclusively got the platformer Conker's Live and Reloaded, an improved version of the good old Conker's Bad Fur Day from Nintendo 64. The core gameplay and story remained the same, so I'll start with them. The game told us about the adventures of Conker the Squirrel, another example of the cartoon furry enough platformer genre. But unlike its peers, Conker deconstructed the genre by using adult humor. On one hand, the story was about usual cartoonish adventures, but on the other hand, it didn't hesitate to include vulgarity, strong language, alcohol, and other joys of PGI-18. Gameplay-wise, Conker was a typical 3D platformer where you had to run and jump your way through levels. The classic formula was diluted with numerous contextual actions that changed the gameplay depending on the situation. For example, in some areas it was necessary to throw objects and in the others to even shoot. As for the Xbox remake, it could boast two major improvements. The first one being, as you might have guessed, updated graphics. The entire Conker was completely redrawn, what made it look like a decent platformer of today. The second and more important update was the redesigned multiplayer from the original game. It contained several standard modes like Capture the Flag or Deathmatch, as well as different characters with their own classes, weapons, and abilities. To be frank, I'm not exactly sure who needed multiplayer for a game like this, but judging by the reviews, it was more than popular. More than that, Conker as a whole wasn't just popular, it was one of Xbox's best sellers.
You don't look much like hero material to me, but Maze knows what he's doing, I suppose.
Today's video wouldn't be complete without another memorable game, Fable, from the renowned video game fantasist Peter Molyneux. This action RPG can be called a truly authorial brainchild, which shows how badly Molyneux wanted to bring his incredible idea to life. To begin with, Fable offered us not just to play a particular story, but to live an entire life in a very cozy fantasy world. And I mean literally, we had to control the character starting from the very childhood and until his oldest years. Various interactions with the in-game world made the path of our protagonist extremely eventful. For example, you were able to communicate with in-game characters, have relationships, and face all the consequences. Go buck wild in local taverns, fish, change your appearance, buy a house and furnish it. In short, do anything that comes to mind. But that's not the end of it. All those activities changed the protagonist. For example, fighting without armor left deep scars, wearing menacing robes with spikes and skulls intimidated those around you, and practicing magic accelerated the protagonist's aging. Naturally, such great and elaborate variability couldn't do without the role-playing and karma system, which also affected the character's appearance. And don't forget that all these metamorphoses occurred in the course of a fairy tale story. The character's home village was burned when he was a child, and his family was murdered. A sad beginning to say the least, but it provided excellent ground for character development, numerous important moral choices, and of course, a confrontation with the local evil. In addition to the main plot, Fable also had many side quests with stories of their own. Keep in mind that all of the above is intertwined, which gives us a truly believable world and a great opportunity to live in it. To sum up, I'd say that despite a rough start, Microsoft was able to both firmly establish itself in the market and give players a whole number of video game masterpieces. Of course, the first Xbox can be called a total success. For example, the console was poorly welcomed in Japan because of its distinctly American design, and in general, Microsoft didn't get too much profit from the sales. But I don't think that all of this should matter to a console that successfully met the competition with Dreamcast and PlayStation 2. And what do you think? I invite you to share your opinion in the comments. As always, don't forget to leave a like and smash the bell button. Stay tuned.